Explorations. Probing global diversification. We travel the world so you don't have to.
Where on Earth or in space did these stars come from? What magic...
John Gauveau, astronomy specialist of 30 years and president of the Hamilton Amateur Astronomy Club, will share his insights about how stars have been used as an accurate map in ancient times for navigation.
We should maybe explain to people what the difference is between astronomy and astrology, and I think people often confuse those two terms. Scientists don't, but often I think people who don't pay as close attention to the two confuse them. Maybe can you just talk about those two?
Absolutely, Dzintar, and that's a really good point. And being out in the doing public programs and showing people stuff through my telescope and that, I encounter that all the time. People come up and use the wrong terminology, say astrology when they mean astronomy, or vice versa. And the words are so similar; it's entirely understandable. And of course, they share a common root. Hundreds of years ago, astronomy and astrology were one and the same. But with a modern understanding of how science works, and in the Renaissance era when the modern scientific method was introduced, the two forged different paths. And astronomy, with the M, astronomy, and what I am involved in, is the hardcore science of it. It's the actual observation at a telescope of the stars and the galaxies and the planets, and it's understanding how they work and so on. And astrology is the application of that to humanity and to our everyday life. And of course, in a nutshell, what it is your horoscope in the newspaper. When you open up your newspaper and you read your daily horoscope, that's astrology. And although those 12 constellations that are listed in the newspaper are actual constellations and are up there in the sky, what you're reading there in the newspaper bears no bearing at all to the actual science of astronomy.
What would you call astrology then, as opposed to astronomy? Astronomy being the science, astrology is?
A pseudoscience. Something that travels in the guise of a science, but really isn't. It doesn't employ any scientific methods, and we aren't learning anything about the real world from it. So it's a pseudoscience. But if you wanted to be kinder about it, you could say it's an entertainment, I suppose.
Okay. So what is a constellation then?
Well, that's a great question. A constellation is, it's a picture in the sky. They're the biggest, grandest dot-to-dot game that we can play, and we've been doing that for thousands of years. So we look up into the nighttime sky, we see a random smattering of stars, and we impose pictures onto that. Now, the constellations are completely arbitrary and artificial constructs. They're fabrications that bear no relation at all to the actual structure and physicality of the universe. But they're our guideposts. They're street signs through the night. They're literally our guiding stars. And if they tell us nothing about the true nature of the cosmos, they speak volumes about ourselves. They speak to our history, our culture, our morals and myths are up there, our heroes and villains. It's all spelled out for us up there in the stars.
Who came up with the concept, or are there multi origins to this concept of constellations?
Well, you're exactly right. There are multiple origins to the constellations. We see that different cultures through history and all around the world have all created their own constellations. Now, there's certainly a very practical reason for this. So you could imagine in ancient times, in a pre-literate or illiterate society, the constellations were your calendar. So when you couldn't go to a local bookstore and buy a wall calendar full of, cute kittens or something, or even if you could get one of those but couldn't read it because you were illiterate, the appearance of the night sky told you the time of year and the pairing of, say, a certain constellation with the sun, or the first rising of another constellation would tell you when to plant your crops, or when to expect the start of the rainy season, or that the onset of a flooding river was imminent. And this was really important information. And you could determine all of that yourself just by looking up at the night sky. And so we see that in ancient Mesopotamia, in ancient China, in indigenous cultures in North America and South America, they've all created their own constellations that they used for these purposes.
So they're like guideposts for life and change of seasons and so on. Sort of an anthropological question, really.
Absolutely, it is. And in each particular case, of course, they imposed imagery onto the stars that was pertinent to them, things that were important to them. And so looking at the different constellations that have sprung out of different cultures around the world tells us a lot about the origins of that culture and those peoples.
And, I guess the changing position, I have a question here. It says, how is it possible to follow the stars when they're always changing position in the sky? But I would sort of reverse that and say it's the position that they look for in the sky that tells you whether the time is right for, say, certain crops to be planted, or whether it's time for you to go to sleep, or, whether the winter's on its way, that kind of thing.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly how they were used and the practical value they held. And so we can look up at the night sky now, and although we don't need to use the changing constellations for those purposes, as they have done over the past millennia, over thousands and thousands of years, we can still use them for our own practical purposes today. So for instance, I refer to them as like street signs, right? So they're our roadmap around the nighttime sky, and we'd be lost in the night without them. So the analogy is that I often give is this: imagine that Dzintar and Nina. So imagine you wanted to come over to my house to look through my telescope, and you'd be more than welcome to. But unfortunately, there are thousands and thousands of homes in the city that I could possibly live in, and one way to find me would simply be to start knocking on doors. So you could go, knock, knock, does John live here? No. Okay, knock, knock, does John live here? No. Well, very quickly you'd become frustrated because there are simply so many houses and doors to knock on. You need one simple piece of information, an address. Even a street name would help tremendously. It then becomes all so simple. With a street name, instead of thousands and thousands of doors to knock on, you're down to a couple of dozen, and that's doable. Well, the constellations are like that for the nighttime sky. There are street names for the nighttime sky. So if I tell you that there is a star up there, that if you look at very closely, it is not just one star, but two stars very close together. And I would ask you to imagine being on a planet, living there, and having two suns in your sky instead of one. That would be an amazing thing. And you might want to go outside and look at that. But when you get out there and look up at the sky, there are thousands of stars up there. And you're faced with the same problem as knocking on doors all over the city. How do you find that one star? But if I tell you the name of the constellation, if I give you basically a street name for you to look at and say that, well, it's in the Big Dipper, then instead of thousands and thousands of stars, now you only have to look at 7 stars. And sure enough, there it is. The second star in the handle of the Big Dipper is not just one star, but 2 very, very close together. And you can go out and do that any night and look at the Big Dipper and see that for yourself. So this is the practical value that they still hold for us today. If we don't use the constellations to tell us when the river's going to flood or when to plant our crops, we still use them to guide us through the nighttime sky and show us all the marvels of the universe that we can see.
You're certainly very enthusiastic about this subject.
I certainly am. It's something that never fails to amaze and delight.
I was just going to say, make a point about constellations too. The groups of stars that make up the constellations, they don't necessarily have to be clustered together in the heavens. They could be millions of light years apart. It's just how we perceive them here on Earth that they form that little cluster that we've identified. Is that right?
That's exactly right, Dzintar, and that's an excellent point. It's only from our unique perspective here on Earth that we see the constellations that we do. in the reality of the universe, as we could travel out through our galaxy and out amongst the stars, we would see that some of these stars are very close to us, some are very distant, and they may not have any bearing at all to each other. But it is from our unique position here on Earth that we see that specific pattern, and we can make these constellations. If we happen to be on a planet circling another star, we would not see the same constellations that we do. It is very much something that is unique to us.
Let me see if I understand this. So someone in Africa will see a totally different sky or a constellation than we will.
Well, somebody in Africa could very well look at exactly the same stars and create an entirely different constellation than we would. And they would undoubtedly impose onto it imagery and ideas that were pertinent and important to them. So as an example, there are 88 constellations that we use today, and most of them, 48 out of the 88, date back to the ancient Greeks. But, of course, they adopted their system from the Babylonians, and they probably borrowed heavily from the Sumerians, which is about 3,000 years before the Greeks. We can date some constellations back 5,500 years. But if we look around at other cultures, we see that they also have rich histories of constellations. So of these ones, the ancient Greek ones that we use, of course, we're familiar with some of them, like Orion, the hunter, or Leo, the lion, Hercules, of course, Perseus, and Andromeda, the princess. These were things that were important to the ancient Greeks. These were the hearts and roots of their stories and their mythology. So they looked up into the sky and they imposed those things up there. In different cultures, like China or, the native North Americans, they've imposed different imagery and different mythology and different ideas and stories up there. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Africa, if you travel down into the southern hemisphere, you can see a completely different collection of stars because you're looking in a different direction out into the universe. So the Greeks see basically the same stars that we do, but if you travel down into southern Africa, you would see completely different stars. Now, many of the constellations that are in the southern hemisphere are ones that were imposed by the great explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries who traveled down below the equator, came face to face with completely different stars for the first time, and had to come up with their own constellations. So they imposed on them things that were important to them as sailors and explorers. So we see in the southern hemisphere, instead of the ancient Greek heroes, we see parts of a sailing ship or the tools they used, like compasses or sextants. And, it makes me wonder that if we were to name the constellations today, if we would do the same thing and name them after things that were important to us. So instead of, Orion the hunter or Leo the lion, we'd have Microwavium the oven or something like that.
So what would happen during the day? How would they follow a constellation during the day? Or is it only at night they would figure out the constellation or the route they wanted to travel, and then during the day they would have to figure it out? What would happen with these sailors?
Fill in the gaps, maybe. I don't know.
Absolutely. If you're referring to these explorers, traveling the world and sailing their vessels around, you're absolutely right. Of course, the stars were their direction, were their compass, and they were able to use them for navigation, celestial navigation, which is a fine science and art, absolutely, and a complex one, and I tip my hat to those that are skilled in it. And celestial navigation, very important. But of course, during the day, you have something else there as your guidepost. You have the sun. And the stars are there, of course, day and night, but we don't see them during the day because the sun outshines them so grandly. But of course, you can also use the sun as your guidepost and as your navigation. We know it rises in the east and sets in the west, and in between it passes to either the north or the south, depending on which hemisphere you're in. The much greater difficulty, of course, is what happens if you run into a stretch of bad weather and it's cloudy night after night and day after day. Then you have navigational problems.
You end up back home without realizing it.
Exactly.
How difficult is it to learn to read the constellations?
Well, at first it seems very daunting. because it is completely random. The stars are scattered across the sky in a completely random fashion, and imposing these arbitrary shapes onto them, and then assigning them often challenging names that have their roots in Latin and that, seems like a very, very daunting task. But in truth, it's not as bad as it sounds. So what I always recommend to people is that they start with just one constellation. And, of course, you already know the names of many constellations. There's 12 of them printed in your newspaper every day in the horoscope section, as we mentioned. And those ones, Capricornus and Scorpius and Aries and Taurus, they're all actually up there. But another one that you might be more familiar with, that many people would already recognize, is the Big Dipper. The Big Dipper is easily visible at any time of year from here in Canada, and it's an easy one to recognize, and many people already know it. So I recommend that they start with just that one, and they can use that one to guide them on to others. So the Big Dipper is represented by 7 stars, and it's actually part of another larger constellation called Ursa Major, the Great Bear. But if we look at just that grouping of 7 stars, 4 stars that make up the bowl of the dipper, and then 3 more that make up a handle. So it's kind of like a pot with a crooked handle, a cooking pot with a crooked handle. If you look at the very front stars of the bowl of the dipper, you can go from one to the other and carry on in that same direction, and they point directly at the North Star. So now you've found the North Star. And the North Star is the last star in the handle of the Little Dipper. So now you've found a second constellation. Fantastic. Or you might use the Big Dipper in the other direction and look at that curving handle of the Dipper. And if you follow the curve of the handle, the arc, it leads to another star called Arcturus, which is the brightest star in the constellation of Bootes, the herdsman. Fantastic. Now you found another constellation. There's Bootes, the herdsman. And if you carry on from Bootes in the same direction, you arrive at the constellation of Virgo. And we have little memory aids to help us. So the arc in the handle of the Big Dipper creates an arc to Arcturus. And from there, a spike, a straight line drawing a spike, leads you to the star Spica, which is the brightest star in the constellation Virgo. So arc to Arcturus, spike to Spica, and now instead of just one constellation, like the Big Dipper, now you've found your way to Bootes and Virgo and Ursa Minor, and you're on your way. And you can launch off from those. So at first it's very daunting, and it seems like a big sky, and it really is. And of course the stars are constantly moving, and the seasons are changing. But with time, they become old and familiar friends, a comfortable place to visit on a warm summer evening, or a reminder on even the coldest winter night that eventually the seasons and the stars will change and give a rebirth to spring again. Eventually it becomes comfortable, familiar, and you'll enjoy visiting again and again.
So,
go ahead, sorry.
So John, what about these new stars that are being formed all the time? Do they have an effect on those constellations? Does the skies change? Do these constellations change or evolve?
That's an excellent question. And the answer is yes, they do change. And they change on a grand scale. But because it is such a big, big scale, the change appears to happen very, very slowly. So in the course of one lifetime, I'm not going to notice a significant change in the positions of the stars. The stars of my youth will be the stars of my old age. They will be the same old familiar friends. But when we look back to some of the cultures we've been talking about, the ancient Greeks, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, we can actually tell that there are changes that have occurred since that time. So over the span of thousands of years, yes, we can see changes occurring. And that's something that we do have to take into account, But over the course of one lifetime, no, that's not something we have to worry about. Now, Nina, something else you said is a really good point. There are new stars being created all the time. So one of the constellations I mentioned is Orion the Hunter, and it's visible in the wintertime, not right now, it's visible in the wintertime, but it's a very big and very prominent constellation and a very, very beautiful one. It never fails to get oohs and ahs, rich with bright stars. And Orion is the hunter, and he's depicted standing there with a club raised in his hand, a shield in another hand, and hanging from his belt is a sword. So goes the depiction in our star charts and what he represents. And if you look at the stars that make up the sword that hangs from his belt, there's one that's somewhat different from the others. In a photograph, it shows up a very vivid pink. And if you look at it with any kind of optical aid,